Hi, this is Yushan of Young Contortions, and in this video I will demonstrate several techniques used in double knitting, including casting on, reading a chart, working a neat slip stitch edge, and how to bind off. I will leave the timestamps below so that you can skip to the component most helpful for you. As always, if the pattern of a piece that I'm wearing in the video or that I use for demonstration is available, then I will put a link in the description below. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Here I have an example of double knitting. In this panel, as you can see, two colors are used, a main color and a contrasting color. The fabric is double layered thick, and on the reverse side, you can see it's the exact same color pattern, but with the colors reversed. This is a very simple two-color chart. If you're not used to reading knitting charts, the chart will always show you the right side of work. This means on right side of rows, you would read the chart from right to left, and on wrong side of rows, you would read from left to right. And in the round, every round is a right side round, so you will be always reading from right to left. Now, if this was a Fair Isle regular color chart, then each of these squares represents one stitch in the respective colors. However, in double knitting, each of these squares represent a pair of stitches or two stitches. Usually it's a knit stitch followed by a purl stitch in pairs. I wanted to show you how to use the magic cast on to start a double knitting project. If you worked this method before, you know you need two needles held in parallel with a slip knot on either one of the needles. In this project, I'm going to use the beige yarn to represent the light color and the red yarn as the dark color in the chart. Again, each of these squares represent two stitches, meaning that you need to cast on double the amount of stitches that's shown in the chart. This chart has 10 stitches across, meaning I need 20 stitches to work the full pattern, and I want 2 extra stitches on each side. That makes 24 stitches in total to cast on. And here I have both strands of yarn tied in a slip knot on the top needle. Tension one yarn on your index finger and the second yarn on your thumb. You will always cast on with your thumb stitch first. Your pattern should be clear which color should be cast on first. In this case, I'm casting on the beige color first. By looping it counterclockwise onto the top needle. Cast on the index finger yarn by looping it clockwise onto the bottom needle. And now you have cast on a pair of stitches, one in each color. Show this again. Cast on the thumb yarn by looping it counterclockwise on the top needle, and the index finger yarn by looping it clockwise on the bottom needle. Keep casting on the pairs of stitches until you have the number you need to work your color chart. You will end with the second color, whereas you started with the first color. Once you have finished casting on the number of stitches you require, twist the two strands of working yarn together to secure them. Orientation is very important at this point. For instance, if you hold the needles with the working yarns on the left, then you can work in the round with what was the top needle holding your right side stitches. In this demonstration, I will work flat, so turn the entire thing until the working yarns are on the right, and I will start by working a wrong-sided row. For the first row, you will need a third needle, or if you're working around, you will have two parallel circular needles. You can just choose one of them to use to work the first row. Start by knitting the first stitch using the color of the first stitch, making sure that both yarn strands are in the back of the work. Knit that normally. For the next stitch, you will bring both working yarn strands to the front of your work. And then using the yarn color that's the stitch on the back needle, purl one stitch from the back needle or the top needle. And you need to work this stitch through the back loop. So purl through the back loop. Bring both yarn strands again to the back to work the next pair of stitches. Knit one from the front needle, normally through the front loop. Then bring both yarn strands to the front of the work. And purl one stitch from the back needle through the back loop. The first row is going to be quite tight, as you see me doing here. So just make sure that you work the first row quite slowly and carefully. So while I work through the rest of the first row, I will give you some hints about casting on and the orientation. Usually it works very well to cast on with your main color first on the top needle. And then when you're working around, you will start with a right-sided row or round. And when you work flat, you will first work a wrong-sided row. Your pattern should be very clear how to cast on and how to orient, but sometimes patterns are not always very clear. So it does take a little bit of figuring out how to do the cast on if you choose to use the magic cast on. And here we're coming on the last few stitches of the first row, again working in pairs. Meaning first knit from the front needle with both yarn strands in the back. And purling from the back needle with both yarn strands in the front. And you need to purl through the back loop. So there are all the stitches of the first row. And the last thing to do is to slip over the slip knot. And I do like to keep the slip knot on for a few rows and then drop it from the needles. Turn the work, and we're ready to work the first row of the chart, and I will switch to larger needles at this point. So let's start working our color chart. Your pattern should be quite clear whether your first row should be a plain row or if you start the chart right away. In this case, I have already worked one foundational row and all of my stitches are on one needle. So now I switch to the larger needles and I will start my color chart. Remember that each of these squares represent a pair of stitches. The light color is our main color and the dark color is our contrasting color. I have cast on a couple of extra edge stitches and we'll work those first. And those are worked plain. Slip over the slip knot. The first edge stitch will just be in the main color. So you can hold the two strands of yarns how you would like. My favorite way is to hold the main color in my right hand and to tension the contrasting color on my left hand. The first stitch is edge stitch. we're going to knit the first stitch with both yarns in back using the main color. Then bring both strands of yarn to the front. We're going to work our contrasting color. The contrasting color will be worked with both yarns in front, and we will purl through the second stitch. And that's the main pair of double knit stitches. Knit with one color with both yarn strands in the back, and then always purl the next stitch with the second color with both yarn strands in the front. And these are my 2 pairs of edge stitches. I will now start the main color chart. The first stitch is a main color stitch. And the main color stitch means I will simply knit with the main color with both strands of yarns in the back, and then purl with a contrasting color with both strands of yarns in the front. The next stitch is a contrasting color stitch. And for this one, we will knit with a contrasting color with both yarns in the back. So the contrasting color comes first this time. And then we will bring both yarns strands to the front and purl the second of the pair of stitches with the main color with both yarn strands in front. So we have reversed the order. Contrasting color first, and then the main color in the purl. So let's do that again, because the next stitch is again a contrasting color stitch. Knit using the contrasting color with both yarn strands in back, and then purl using the main color with both yarn strands in front. And that is our pair of stitches in the contrasting color. I have worked the full chart, and remember that I have kept 2 pairs of edge stitches. The first pair I'm going to work normally, and then I'll show you how to work a slipped stitch salvage edge. So the next pair I will work normally, main color knitting with both strands of yarn in back, then bring both strands of yarn in front and purl using contrasting color. For the salvage edge, I will slip the last pair of stitches purlwise. First, leave both strands of yarns in the back, slip the main color stitch purlwise. Then bring only the contrasting color to the front. Leave the main color in the back and slip the contrasting stitch purlwise. Our 2 strands are now on different sides of the work. We will turn the entire needle to work a wrong-sided row. To work the wrong-sided row, first we will knit and purl through the salvage edge slip stitches. The contrasting color now should be on the back of the work, and the main color should be in the front of the work. To begin, I again place the main color strand in my right hand and the contrasting color in my left hand, as I usually like to do. We will first knit through the first stitch with the contrasting color. Then bring the contrasting color to the front. Your main color should already be at the front of work, and purl through the second of the pair of salvage edge stitches. Bring both strands of yarns in the back, and we're ready to work through the next wrong-sided row. I have worked 2 stitches now, knitting with the contrasting color and purling with the main. We will now start working the second row, which is a wrong-sided row. Now, we have to flip the color surrounding our heads, because in a wrong-sided row, we will be purling with the color that is shown. For example, the first stitch is a contrasting color stitch. What this means on a wrong-sided row is that we will knit first with the main color, so the opposite color that's shown. Move both strands in the front, and now we are purling with the color that is shown in the chart. We have 2 more stitches to work in the contrasting color, meaning knit in the main color and then purl in the contrasting color. So here you see I've worked 3 contrasting color stitches shown in the chart. The next stitch is a main color stitch. On the wrong-sided row, this means that we will first knit with a contrasting color with both yarn strands in the back, move both strands in the front, and now we are purling with the color that is shown in our color chart. So on the wrong side, always think about purling in the color that is shown.
Okay.
I've now worked through the second row completely. Remember that we have the edge stitches, and the edge stitches now are in the contrasting color first. So knit with the contrasting color, and then purl with the main color. Again, I'm going to slip the last stitch of this row. First, slip 1 purlwise with both yarn strands in back, and then bring the main color strand to the front of the work. Leave the contrasting color in back and slip the last stitch purlwise. Because I've already worked through a few rows, I'm just going to let the slip knot slip off the needle. So now we're ready to work through the rest of the color chart, working the right and wrong side of rows slightly differently, and remember to slip the last pair of stitches in each row. And here I have worked through the entire color chart. What you see is that when you slip the last pair of stitches in each row, you end up with this really beautiful, neat salvage edge on both sides. The right side of the work will look just like your color chart, and the wrong side of the chart should be the reverse colors. I have worked one last plain row to prepare for the bind off. And for double knitting, there are several ways to bind off, but I prefer the sewn bind off, which gives it a very neat edge that matches your cast on. Cut your yarn, leaving very long strands, about 4 times the length of your bind off row around, and choose one color. I have chose the contrasting color to bind off with, and thread that onto a tapestry needle with a large eye. To work the bind off, it's just like working a tubular sewn bind off. The first step is we will insert the needle from the back to the front between the first 2 stitches. Pull the yarn all the way through. Then we will insert the needle knitwise through the next stitch, and this should be a purl stitch, and pull that yarn through. Then we will insert the needle knitwise through the first stitch again, and let it drop off the needle. Then skip the next stitch, insert your needle purlwise through the next stitch after that. And now insert your needle purlwise through the first stitch on the needle and let it drop off. And now we're at the beginning of the sequence again. Insert your needle from back to front between the next 2 stitches, and then knitwise through the second stitch on the needle. Insert the needle knitwise through the first stitch and let it drop off the needle. Insert the needle purlwise, skipping a stitch, so in the next stitch over. And then insert your needle purlwise through the first stitch on the needle and let it drop off. And continue repeating the sequence of stitches, making sure that you're not pulling the yarn too tightly as you go. And here are just the last few stitches. I'm continuing the sequence for the tubular bind off. And here I have the last 2 stitches left. So you will insert your needle again from the back to front, insert it through the next stitch on the needle knitwise, insert the needle knitwise through the first stitch and let it drop off the needle. And now you just have 1 stitch left. So simply pull the yarn tail purlwise through that last stitch and let it drop off the needle. As you bind off, it's important to tension your yarn tail so that your bind off edge is not too tight. So you want to pull the yarn snugly, but not too tightly so that you have some elasticity. And here we have it, a completed double knitted piece. And I now want to talk about the gauge differences between Fair Isle and double knitting. In the orange, I have a classic stranded color work piece. You see that it's all stranded on the wrong side of the work, and on the right side is the color pattern. Versus double knitting, where we have the right side and the wrong side, or 2 sides, that both have the color work worked. But because one is stranded and the other is knitted on both sides of work, you can see stranded knitting tend to be more squared off with more similarities between your row and your stitch gauge. Whereas the double knitting, you have usually shorter rows. So you should take that into account when you convert any Fair Isle to double knitting.